On our 2 o'clock! Their lines are fluctuating! Gearsep shouted excitedly, nearly losing his grip on the tank's targeting scope. Baldvek grinned, a feral growl of excitement escaping his lips. Finally! What's caused it? Is there any way we can exasperate the situation aside from just charging in there and shooting everything to hell? I think it's those rovers again. Which squad do you think they're from? It doesn't matter, Bloodfeck cut in. How are they still alive and what's their current situation? Honestly, I don't know if they are still alive. There's too many vehicles and Volsa. Wait, the Volsa? They're attacking the Celsi vehicles. They're attacking their own team. I knew they didn't have a firm control over those beasts. No one can control something that powerful. Now the only question is, what set them off? Does it really affect us right now? Shrugged Blackfeck. We can worry about how to get them to defect later. Right now we're going to use the weakened lines on the edge of that skirmish to punch through and hopefully end this battle by outflanking them. Relaying his orders to his sub-commanders, the Dominion Horde, now containing more than 30 squads of repurposed stealthy vehicles, moved as one towards the outskirts of the swelling maelstrom where the lines were weakened due to the units called to assist with the Volsa uprising. As Baldvek's squad led the charge, coil guns blazing, he felt pity for any Dominion forces caught within the storm of metal and scales. Nothing could survive such bedlam unscathed. Dear Journal, remember that whole military genius thing? Yeah, more like prodigy. Not that I'm going to go around bragging about it. I totally am. What had started out as a friendly tussle between blood enemies had become a full-fledged war in and of itself, with an entirely new set of rules and the battle raging around it. Those I had previously thought were enemies were now fighting with my squad, or rather, for my squad. Their hover hummers had been shredded, flipped, and pummeled from every side. I was surprised they were still large enough for my friends to use as cover. Crouching beneath the remnants of their rise, my squad fired at any dragon that got too close. They seemed to have accepted the enemy's assistance and, thankfully, refrained from informing our new friends of our true allegiance by not attacking them. I still couldn't believe that the enemy still thought we were on the same team. What else could be keeping them from attacking us? But I wasn't going to complain. I, on the other hand, had no hover hummer wreckage to hide under. Not that I would have been content to do so if I had. My friends were basically helpless without the death ray cannons of their hummers, and I wasn't about to let a stray dragon pick them off. Circling the smoking vehicles, I attacked any drake that got too close, and there were many. I was becoming genuinely exhausted, helped in no small way by the ridiculously thin air, and my jumps were a mere fraction of their original length, my reflexes slow. I was fortunate the dragons seemed to be faring even worse than I. They probably needed more air, so it made sense, but it was the only reason I was able to keep fighting so many when I had before so often struggled to kill only one. Now I waded through their attacks, dodging their drunken attempts to stop me with my lagging yet still greater strength. I wouldn't be able to keep it up forever though. My squad's vehicles, though in the same general area, were still too far apart for me to guard completely at the same time. Our fight seemed to be drawing every dragon from the battlefield, and despite the monumental effort on part of our new frenemies, the drake count continued to increase. My fears were realised when 2 dragons attacked from either side, one going for Manthiel's rover and the other attacking Rex, one of the squad's heavies. I was closer to Rex, so sprinted, more like jogged at this point, to intercept his reptile. So intent was it upon his prey, it failed to notice me until I stabbed it through the wing and in the side. That got its attention, and it buckled, throwing me with its wing, roaring in pain. I jumped back up, renewing my attack. Infuriated, it leapt at me, which meant the fight was over. Dodging to the side in the now familiar maneuver, I wrecked his neck and chest with my lava scimitars, cutting his windpipe and damaging his cardiac area. I wasn't exactly sure where the heart was, but I assumed if I hacked around the general area where I assumed it to be, I would achieve the same effect. Despite my quick disposal of the beast, I'd been too slow. The other dragon had reached Manthiel's downed hummer, and I could already hear shouts of alarm and panic through the monster roars. No! I had worked too hard, protected them for too long to fail now. Raising my ragged, smoke-torn voice, I bellowed in rage and denial as I pulled upon my final reserves of strength, sprint jumping towards the unfolding carnage. Refusing to think of what I would find, I jumped over the flipped hummer, bringing the dragons back into view. I took advantage of my position to land on top of it, driving my blades as far into its back as I could, hoping one of my friends was still alive. It didn't even react. The drake didn't even move despite my burning weapons sticking out of his hide. What the? It was already dead. Shocked by this unexpected turn of events, I slid down its back and into the do-it-yourself bunker underneath the hovercraft. It was easy to scramble into since the dragon's head was shoved into it, propping the hover hummer with a foreleg, where it would have been able to bite and grind my squadmates into dust. The inside of the foxhole was a mess. 2 squadmates lay on the ground, bleeding from wounds that had been instantly fatal, and a third lay unconscious against a wall, bleeding from the stumps of what had been 2 of his legs. Manthiel, however, was the focus of my attention. Orange skin, the pale shade of tang powder, he stood trembling, his arm attached by a thread, the other end clamped within the dragon's mouth, which was mere centimeters from his face. It had died in that position, but I still couldn't tell you how or why. Then I saw its glazed, open eyes. Every blood vessel within its slit irises appeared to have burst simultaneously, flooding its green eyes with blood as deep a red as mine. I looked at Manthiel in advance. Still shaking, he held up the pin to one of those grenades that was so effective against me. It took me a moment to comprehend what he was trying to say. When the light bulb flickered to life, my eyes went wide, and I immediately pried the beast's jaws apart. There, cradled upon its tongue as his final trophy, was Manthiel's disembodied arm, his hand still clutching the brain-fried grenade that had ended the creature's life. I stared at Manthiel again. Raising his 3 remaining arms, he gave me a shaky thumbs up. Manthiel was trembling, but he didn't care if anyone saw it. If anyone had asked, he would have told them the truth in an instant. He was scared shitless. The only difference now was that he wasn't even considering running away. Even if he had wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to make it far in the confused disarray outside the cover he and the other squadmates had dug underneath their overturned rover. They weren't really doing anything from their position. The only weapons that were having any effect in this battle were core guns or turrets, and without that rover, the only thing his group had now were anti-tank and heavy pulse guns, a few pistols, and 1 nerve-jam grenade each. With such paltry weaponry, they wouldn't be able to do a thing if anyone decided to attack them. Thankfully, Kuhlman did have a say in the matter, and he had fusion sights, which were far more effective in his hands than any coil gun. Manthiel had never seen him fight like it the way he did now. A blur across the battlefield, he shot from Volza to Volza, slaying each and every one that approached their impromptu entrenchment. Manthiel had seen him move fast before, but he seemed to be drawing upon an inner power source he had never before used. He was killing Volza, as though they were just as weak as any other being. The exertion was obviously taking its toll on him, however, and Manthiel could tell he was getting tired as his movements began to slow. Despite his growing fatigue, he still managed to stop every Volza which threatened their position. That was why Manthiel wasn't worried when one started charging their position. At any moment, Kuhlman would come charging in, slicing the monster's head off with a single swipe or snap his neck with his bare hands. He had never actually seen Kuhlman do that before, but Manthiel didn't doubt he could. When it had closed half the distance unimpeded, Manthiel started to feel the first flutters of panic within his gut. Judging by the nervous shuffling of his companions by his side, they were as well. When it had closed 2/3 of the distance and Kuhlman still had yet to make an appearance, the group of 4 opened fire against the approaching beast, hoping to slow it while Kuhlman took his sweet time. An anti-tank pulse hit it square in the nose, which only served to enrage it, causing it to double its speed and traverse the remaining distance in 2 enormous leaps. It was upon them before they could react. Lifting the rover off the hole, the Volza shoved its head into their improvised cover, instantly transforming their place of refuge into a death trap. One of their numbers died instantly, his upper body parting ways from the lower. Manthiel couldn't understand. Where is Kuhlman? Why has he suddenly abandoned us? Panic threatened to overwhelm him completely as another squadmate met a similar fate as the first. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. The same voice of paralyzing terror that had resounded within his head the same day he ran from the Volza that massacred his first squad pounded once again within his mind until it echoed in his ears as well. His voice giving flesh to the most basic of instincts, self-preservation. A roar shattered the air around him, but it wasn't from the Volza. It was an echo from the past, the bravado of the challenge Kuhlman had thrown in that first battle. It wasn't the same, however. This was no herald of extinction. This was a scream of loss, a cry of failure and pain, but even more than that, it was the rejection of defeat, a disavowal of failure. It pulsed with an oath of vengeance and a pledge of retribution. It drove away the shackles of fear that had rooted his feet to the ground and replaced his trembling with the stiffened limbs of rebellion. As before, Manthiel found himself repeating Kuhlman's shout, but for a different reason. He would not let this be his end. He would not die without a struggle. He would have his revenge upon this beast, not only for the lives of those it and his kind had already taken from him, but for making him forget that he was more than just his frightened prey. He would be his downfall. It struck again. Whether by some preternatural insight or because he had tripped a few moments before it struck, Manthiel's only other living squadmate managed to keep anything vital out of the beast's mouth. It was still quick though, and managed to catch several of the unfortunate soldier's legs, reducing them to stumps. Distracted with his newest victim, it didn't notice as Manthiel yanked the nerve jam grenade off his belt and pulled the pin. It did notice it when he shot it in the head with his anti-tank gun. Blinded by the light, it roared in anger, changing targets with a speed that defied plausibility. Manthiel was ready though, and as it struck, he stepped towards it, shoving his hand deep within his gullet. Seemingly surprised to find such willing prey, the beast closed its jaws around his arm, removing it with a snick of teeth, slicing through flesh. Manthiel's bellow turned into a roar of pain. The grenade detonated, the Volta's skull acting like a resonance chamber, rebounding, containing, and increasing the deadly emission from the grenade. Every vessel, neuron, and membrane within the monster's head exploded. Only because of its bones and scaled hide did his head itself not explode. It died with the same expression of victory upon his face. A sound came from outside. Human had finally shown up. There was a moment of silence, and then the biped slipped into the hole, pausing to take in the mess. He looked at the dead beast, did a double take, then looked at Manthiel with a question in his eyes. Wordlessly, Manthiel held up the pin still clutched in his hand. It wasn't until he saw the little ring and rod rattling up and down that he realized he was shaking uncontrollably. Human seemed confused for a moment, until he pried the creature's jaws open. Seeing his arm and the grenade still within his mouth, Human looked at Manthiel. For the first time in his memory, a look of shocked incredulity upon his features. Manthiel didn't know what to say, so he just flashed that strange hand gesture, hoping it would suffice. Human took one look at it, then burst into a barking hiccup, which Manthiel realized moments later was raucous laughter. It had worked. Blythe couldn't believe it. The 74th, finding strength in the abandonment of the code, had demonstrated once again why they were considered an elite force. The Celsi forces had been routed, and the cyclone of traitorous Volza and Celsi, which had allowed such a feat, had finally run its course, leaving only severely damaged Celsi and crippled Volza in its wake. The battle wasn't over though. Even though the Celsi line had been destroyed, the sensor outpost, which was the purpose of this fight, still required attention. The only problem was its defences. While the 74th may have managed to vanquish the mobile guarding force, the Celsi had controlled the station since the beginning of the war, giving them ample time to make its defences nigh impregnable. Artillery pulse turrets, core guns, even a few plasma cannons dotted the landscape surrounding the compound. As large as their force was, too many from the 74th had died before they could commandeer a vehicle of their own. Blackfed doubted his forces would be able to punch through the Celsi defences and survive with a force large enough to combat the token guarding squadron inside the station. The battle plan he had been briefed on had told him orbital forces would destroy the compound's defences from a safe distance, making it so that all Blythe had to do was stroll in and claim a victory. He had been told that, while fighting on the ground would be difficult, the fighting above the planet would be a walk in the park, with friendly forces outnumbering hostiles 4-1. The battle on the ground had taken longer than expected. Admiral Likik, the commander of the armada that had acted as an escort to the 74th, should have long ago finished his work above. What's keeping him? Mused Blackfeck. They couldn't afford to wait long. Every moment they waited gave the Celsi more time to regroup and mount a counter-offensive. They were scattered for now, but if they managed to reform, they would pose a significant threat. I'll give them 2 rigs, 1 hour. They will have no choice but to charge and hope for the best. I take back that whole military prodigy part. These Xenos are just military idiots. Manthiel had fainted while I was still laughing at the thumbs up he had given me. Really, it wasn't all that funny. The absurdity of the situation had just struck me at an odd moment and I couldn't help it. I guess all the blood loss did a spell on him, and I ended carrying him and the other guy who was missing his legs out of the hole for the squad medic to take a look at. Leaving Manthiel and Keith, that was the other guy's name, in Hector's capable medical hands, I sought out Turkey. Trexel was still in shock. He stood, transfixed, outside of the hastily evacuated hole he and his other squadmates had created underneath their overturned rover. I'm still alive, right? Things got a little crazy at the end there. Maybe I got hit, but didn't die right away, and the blood loss has me hallucinating. Maybe I'll be dead soon and this will all be over. Then Human walked around the side of the disabled rover. Trixel groaned. It wasn't over. If it was, and Human was in his hallucinations, then he hoped he would die quickly. But if it wasn't a hallucination, then that meant it really was possible for a species like Human to exist, although after seeing him fight today, Trixel would have sworn it to be a fever dream, or the result of a soldier's story gone too far, if such a thing were possible. Human began to move his hands. What's next? Not what I want, unfortunately, thought Trixel, but his hands flashed the orders he himself had only just received. Nothing. We wait. Why? Shit, this would be hard. Human hadn't been able to be briefed on the existence of the Sentry Station. They didn't have a word for it, so how could they? Really, his only task had been to fight, and he'd gone well above and beyond the Call of Duty on that one. Trixel decided to use the words available to him, rather than try to teach Human new gestures. The enemies ahead are too strong. We are waiting for an orbital strike to weaken them. It is taking longer than expected. At least, that's what Trixel hoped he had said. Really, their language was just a conglomeration of nouns and verbs and a few vital adjectives that they arranged in chronological order, with the verb coming after the noun. Trixel didn't know why such a strange sentence structure was used, but he guessed it made sense to Human. It seemed he had understood because his next response made contextual sense. We can't use the tanks? Human gesticulated. We could, but with many casualties. Why not use the dropships? Trixel was surprised by the question. Such a thought hadn't occurred to him at all, yet he wasn't a strategist. After he thought about it for a moment, though, he could see why the plan was flawed. The dropships themselves would survive the charge, but when we got out of them, we'd be torn apart. Still, it was an interesting concept. Maybe if we use the vehicular dropships from the 13th and 32nd to drop the tanks behind enemy lines? No, that wouldn't work either. The vehicular dropships were basically just a cockpit connected to a pair of clamps in the back. The clamps would lock onto the outside of the vehicle in question, and then carry it, crew inside, to the necessary location. That meant, aside from a structural force field to protect the vehicle from the vacuum in space, its outer hull was exposed to an energy-based attacks, and the power from a plasma or core shot would easily overwhelm the force field. Even if the station's defences would have difficulties damaging the heavily plated hulls of the dropships, they would still be able to shoot the vehicles right out from under their charges, resulting in an airborne massacre. Trixel had allowed his mind to wander. A whirlwind of action erupted directly in front of him, and he jumped back in surprise, startled as Human almost hit him in the face trying to regain his attention. An exasperated look upon his face, Human signed. That's not what I meant. Why don't we use the dropships, not as dropships, but as weapons? Confused, Trixel guessed at Human's meaning. The dropship's turrets aren't effective against... With an abrupt motion of his arm, Human cut him off, then started gesturing with short, frustrated signs. Not the turrets, the dropships themselves. Trixel must have misunderstood. What his mind had translated hadn't made any sense. The dropships only had the one turret. How else could they be used offensively? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Human gave him a flat stare, grabbed his hand, then with a force Trixel was scared would tear his arm off, started dragging him towards the nearest operational tank. Really? Why was this so difficult for Turkey to understand? Sure, he wasn't the sharpest knife in the cutlery drawer, more like a spoon. Our gesture language was comprehensive to the point that I had assumed conveying my point would be elementary. Really? Was my idea that unconventional that no one had thought of it before? Never mind Turkey, someone had to. Now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember any indirect artillery fire during the battle. In fact, the tactics I had seen throughout the battle were essentially the same as seen in feudal Europe, just with ray guns, and tanks, and dragons. Yeah, just like feudal Europe. Were the professional militaries of the galaxy really centuries behind the tactics of humanity? I'm not one for thinking about implications, in case you hadn't noticed, so I designed to rein my thoughts back to the matter at hand. Maybe my idea was somewhat unconventional. After all, I was proposing we use the spaceship as a glorified guided missile. It had an autopilot, and I had even seen it used enough times over the last 6 months that I was confident I would be able to do what I had in mind without assistance. As far as being wasteful, I had seen the troopship use a massive alien 3D printer to spit a dropship out every hour. They would be able to make up the loss. I had a feeling our division had lost a lot of men in the battle, so they wouldn't need their dropships to return to the troopships. Heartless, but practical. It would have taken far too long to traverse the length of the battlefield on foot, so I dragged Turkey behind me as I walked to the nearest operational tank. Ignoring the soldier relaxing on his top, I jumped up the hatch, motioning for Turkey to follow. As the soldier looked on in curiosity, Turkey, a familiar look of confusion upon his blue giraffe face, really, I don't think I've ever seen a blue giraffe without that look, climbed into the tank after me. The inside was a mass of buttons and consoles I had no idea how to use, but the navigational array looked nearly identical to that of the dropships. In fact, I think it was more simplistic, as it wasn't equipped to move in 3 dimensions. Thankfully, it was already on and idling. Too bad turning one on wasn't as simple as pushing a button. I think a lever was involved in there somewhere. Keeping up the power, a touch slide on the console is so much less satisfying than flooring a pedal. The tank lurched into action. I may have overestimated the force of acceleration, because the shout of surprise from the top of the tank seemed to fade in the distance after the initial lurch. That, and I had difficulty maneuvering my sweet ride through the maze of rumbling vehicles, despite my many years of navigating Chicago traffic. Actually, Chicago's usually backed up, so those years were probably counterproductive. Still, I had made my decision, and I wasn't slowing down. Handling the tank like a 16-year-old male driving through the red light district, Turkey was thrown about the cabin. Thankfully, it seemed to have been built with the fragility of aliens in mind, and instead of the cramped labyrinth of sharp metal corners that are the cabins of modern tanks, it was far more spacious with padding over every surface. He'd be fine. Not only was my mad rush across the battlefield extremely satisfying to the testosterone-driven beast within me, we made it back to the dropships in record time. Cursing the fact that the tank floated above the ground, making it impossible for me to skid to a stop in a shower of dirt and gravel, I slid the iPhone accelerator back to idle with a feeling of disgust. Aliens had no respect for the simple pleasures in life. Hopping out, I moved to the nearest dropship, urging Turkey to speed up. By the time he joined me in the cockpit, I was implacably tapping my foot as I stood by the navigational console. Gesturing to an orbital rendering of a 20-kilometer radius around the dropship, I moved my hands. Where is the enemy holding? Looking even more confused, Turkey pointed to a general area about 18 kilometers from where we stood on the map. I quickly started hitting buttons, racing to finish before he realized what I was doing. It took him a moment, but when I moved my hand to the red button of engaging, he started spitting and clicking in his alarm at what I had done. Trying to undo all my hard work, he struggled to cancel my commands, but I stopped him, dragging him from the console. I wouldn't want him to miss seeing my idea in action. Depositing him outside the dropship's bay doors, I walked back to the console and hit the red button. I didn't need to translate it to know Turkey was enraged as I jumped from the slowly closing shutterbay door to land by his side. Trixel hadn't wanted to go with Human on his adventure of miscommunication. He had had one great idea, but that didn't mean he would be able to think up another miracle strategy to make an orbital strike appear out of thin air. There was little he could have done, however, as Human had all but forced him into a tank, driving with such reckless abandon Trixel thought he may have survived the battle, only to die at the hands of his squad's most valiant hero. He hoped that 74th man was okay after being thrown from the roof of his charge. Trixel felt bad for having told the soldier not to bother himself and that they were only going for a look. He had sincerely thought it to be the truth when he had said it. Now he stood, watching helplessly as the dropship, doomed by Human's commands, flew into the air on the last trip it would ever make. He knew he shouldn't have been surprised that Human even knew how to enter the meanest of commands into the navigational array. He had shown that he was intelligent in both senses of the word. Well, in some ways. Lessons such as how to recklessly drive a tank and make a dropship commit an elaborate form of self-destruct, he learned with ease. But try to tell him he'd scared the new recruits when he shout-growled in the showers, or whatever it was he had been doing in the communal bathroom after his first battle. Well, he still did that sometimes. So it shouldn't have surprised him that Human had been able to drive the tank or set coordinates for the dropship. He had seen Trixel himself do it for a standard cycle, 6 months now, but he seemed to have missed one crucial point. He had told the ship to go to a particular place, as though it were floating in the vacuum of space. It would travel to that location, then merely shut off the engines. He hadn't specified that it was to travel to that location, then land. Why he wanted to send the enemy a dropship, Trixel couldn't fathom. Did he really think they would just get in it and fly away? Was he really that oblivious? The Celsi never surrendered. Until Human had come, they had rarely had any need to even consider it, unless facing the 74th. Whatever Human had thought the dropship would accomplish, Trixel knew what would really happen. It would fly a perfect arc to the location Human had specified, at drop speeds to boot, unless Trixel had only imagined Human hitting that particular green button, then cut his thrusters mere bolts, half-meters above the ground, impacting with a terrible destructive force. Trixel gasped as this thought occurred to him, just as Dropship's dark silhouette dipped below the tree line. Turret coils shot, artillery pulses, and plasma bolts rushed up from the forest to stop it, but it was moving far faster than any pilot wishing to avoid crashing would have dared, making it almost impossible to hit. That was the point, Trixel realized. The impact could even be faintly heard from where they stood, albeit long after the fact. The debris thrown for the impact was visible much sooner. Bloodfeck was nearing panic. Too many men had died. Where was the orbital strike? What was taking them so long? Were they going to waste this entire day after all their sacrifice? And a sacrifice it had been. A major had handed him a casualty report minutes ago, and it was just as bad as he had feared. Nearly half of the 74th was either dead or unaccounted for, which probably just meant death by Volsa. So intent was he upon the report that he failed to notice a small silhouette fall from the sky towards the enemy defences. "Sir, is that it?" Looking up excitedly, Blythe glanced up just in time to see a geyser of dirt and debris erupting from the forest canopy in the general area of the Celsi entrenchments. "It's about time," growled Blythe, relieved that the 74th had not bled in vain. He looked to the sky, expecting to see a shower of plasma bolts and core shots falling as rain. He was disappointed. "What? Was that all?" he said in disbelief. "That's what I asked, sir." "Shut it, Gearsep." "I don't think it was a plasma bolt or a core shot," piped up Clip. "In fact, if I had to guess and I removed all sense of logic, I would say it looked like a dropship, but that's ridiculous." Blythe agreed. Who would have taken a dropship only to crash it into the ground? They weren't difficult to fly. You literally told it where to go, then pushed a button, and the systems were the opposite of complex, making mechanical failure almost unheard of. His thoughts were interrupted when Doria Thorgia, the commander of Doa's squad, caught his attention as he rushed to the side of his tank, blue with anger. "You know those morons who were just transferred for the 109th? He screamed, spittle flying from his open mouth. "Their commander and that little freak just threw me off my own tank. They tore off like maniacs, and last I saw they were hightailing it back to the dropships. We need to stop them before they get there and steal the dropship and run like the cowards they are. We need to—" Blythe stopped him by holding one of his paws to the screaming squad commander's mouth, more to stop the spit bath than the assault in his ears. "I don't need to do anything until you start speaking coherently. Now, where did you say they were heading?" Removing his paw, Doa continued, as though he'd never stopped. "The dropships! And if we don't catch them—" Blythe replaced the paw so he could be heard as he spoke to Clip. "Take your squad and see if they were responsible for what we just saw. I can't imagine why, but for some reason... His words trailed off as another shadow crossed the sky, hurling towards the enemy location, followed by a single Re, 5 seconds later. Both fell with similar clouds of destruction. When the sound of the second impact reached their ears, it brought screams with it. The cries of despair from the enemy focused his mind, as no technical lecture ever could. He made the connection. A grin splitting his face, Blythe turned to Clip again. "Forget what I just said. Get your squad and 2 others, and follow me to the drop field." "What are we going to do when we get there?" Clip asked. Blythe sighed. A great mind, Clip was not. Bringing his tank to a life with the hum of an anti-grav drive, Blythe popped out the latch once more to answer him. "To do exactly whatever the geniuses who are already there tell us.